911, what are you reporting?
I got a strange going on out here. Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree. I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
Damn it, I'm really confused. All I saw was my dog coming over the fence, and he was dead when she hit the ground. I didn't see any cars. All I saw was my dog coming over the fence.
What are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was?
It was standing up. I'm out here looking through the window now and I don't see anything. I don't want to go outside. Jesus Christ, you better...
Sure.
Dia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
To the show, Clint comes to us from North Carolina. How's it going, man?
Pretty good. How about you, Brian?
I'm fantastic, man. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I'm excited about your encounter stories. I know you've had encounters yourself, and you've had some family members that have had encounters that you're going to share with us. Sort of walk us into and tell us where you were, what you were doing, and what happened to you out there, man.
Okay. I was born and raised in Hamptonville, North Carolina, and it's a really small town. And we had moved there when I was around 4 years old. And I had actually researched and found out that there had been a couple of different encounters on the BFRO website within Yadkin County, but I didn't find that out till much later after being there. And after my encounter is when I started researching a little bit about the area in terms of activity. Well, in 2018, the property that I grew up on, where I was actually living at the time, was right in behind where I grew up. A neighbor of mine, his grandparents lived right next door, and he had bought some property adjacent to them, like basically in behind their house and behind where my parents' house was, where I grew up. And it's basically in the woods, like the wood line was just a few feet from his front door. And it was probably around, I think it was at 9:30. We had a friend, a mutual friend named Lizzie, who was doing some night classes in the neighboring town of Yadkinville. Well, Grant's girlfriend at the time, she decided to make supper a little bit later because she knew her friend Lizzie or whatever was going to be coming a little bit later on because of the night class. Well, me and Grant sat in the living room, and his old lady was in the kitchen cooking up some stuff, and we heard Lizzie's car coming down the driveway, which it's relatively long. It ain't too long, but as you're coming down it, it's like a little gravel path, and on the left-hand side, the wood line that I was speaking about, it's right there, like real close to the driveway, and then on the right-hand side is like a little open field that Grant's grandfather, he messed around it. He had goats in there at one point in time, but at this point in time, there was nothing over there. It's just really grown up. Well, she pulls up and we hear the door slam or whatever, and she walks into the door. And as soon as you walk in is Grant's living room. Me and him sitting there on the couch just watching the movie. And she was pale as a ghost. I mean, completely pale, and just looked in shock. And we knew as soon as she opened the front door that, something obviously had happened. And me and him both, pretty much immediately was like, Lizzie, what's wrong? Are you okay? And she said as she was pulling into the driveway, she just had got off the phone with her mother. And she had a Mini Cooper, and she had the top down on it. And it was summertime. It was pretty warm. So she had the top down or whatever. She got off the phone with her mom and had the radio going at a pretty decent volume. So she's coming down the driveway. She says she just hears these gigantic like footfalls in the wood line to the left of her coming down the driveway. And it was loud enough to get her attention over the radio. So she comes in and we asked her what is wrong. She started telling about the footsteps that she had heard and how loud it was. And my buddy Grant, he just had, I think 2 months prior, had got an AR-15, a Ruger, and he took off, charged into the bedroom, grabs that, and he had a Stevens pump 12 gauge. He grabbed that as well and threw it to me. And he was like, come on, man. Because his grandpa, him and his grandma and grandpa, they're older, and I mean that's their property, like all around where he's at. Well, I mean his where he lives, I can't really be for sure if he bought that property. Anyways, it's his grandfather's property, and he was elderly, and he makes sure to look out for everything and make sure there was nobody out there that wasn't supposed to be. And we go out the door, and he had a little, well, it wasn't little at the time. It was a pup, but it's a, what is the name of that dog? A Great Dane. But, even as a puppy, they're pretty large. And, as a pup or whatever, most, puppies or whatever, they're pretty fearless until they come across something, that spooks them in the beginning. But we've seen this dog chase off an Australian Shepherd coming down the driveway one time. And that dog was pretty menacing. It was a neighboring person's dog. And it ran off possums and wildlife around there. So it was pretty brave. We get outside and step off the porch. And like I said, the wood line's just a few feet from us. And Grant's old lady and Lizzie, they're standing at the door or whatever, kind of being loud. And Grant was like, y'all quieten down. And even over their voices, we can hear the footsteps that she was talking about and how loud it was. And, he told them to quiet down. He's like, just close the door, close the door. So they closed the door, and we're standing there just kind of listening for a second. And we can tell it was from a pretty good distance into the woods or whatever. But, I mean, it was just so loud and crashing through there. It sounded like it was right at us, but we can tell it was a good little ways away. And so Grant, he starts calling out. And mind you, this guy is 6'5", 270. I've never seen this guy fearful of anything since I've known him. We've known each other since childhood. And he calls out. He was like, hey, he's like, who the hell's out there? And he's like, this is private property. And the footsteps continue, just casually strolling on through the woods or whatever. Didn't phase it whatsoever. And then he kind of looks over at me like, if it was a human, they was out there in the woods or whatever, and they more than likely already knew that it was on private property and it wasn't theirs, they would at least, pause or stop or something, call out. But nothing was said. And the footsteps continue. And then he repeats himself a second time and calls out. But on this call, he's like, I've got a firearm, and so does my buddy. He was like, so he's like, you better get to answer me. I want to start shooting. The same thing. The thing just keeps walking on or whatever. And it sounds bipedal. Now I know, even deer, can sound as if they're walking upright if you're at them from a distance at sometimes. But it was just way too loud, way too big sounding to be a deer. And it, like I said, it sounded upright. So, over in the area, going towards the wood line was like a little circular path of grass right before you enter to the woods. So he didn't, not knowing what it was, and it possibly could just be some big guy walking around in the woods. He fired off 3 shots into the ground, over there where the patch of grass is right before you go into the woods. And, we let the echo die down, nothing. Whatever it was didn't even break stride. It just continued crashing about through the woods or whatever. So then he turns around and looks at me, and his eyes are as big as 50-cent pieces. He was like, dude, he's like, what is going on? And I was like, it had me shook, and I was like, what the hell? So then at this point, he don't aim it, directly into the woods, just a little bit higher. So to reach the wood line, an AR-15 holds, 30 rounds. So he just unloads into the wood line. He goes, bah, 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 and completely unloads. And then as soon as it stops or whatever, the echo dies down. Still the same thing. I mean, it never stopped. It never started to go faster, slower, just the same pace the entire time. But and it seemed after that, it began to get louder as if it was getting closer. So then he looked over at me, and he was just like, start shooting. And me still not knowing, at the back of my mind, it possibly could be somebody. I don't want to shoot nobody regardless if they're trespassing, unless, they're an immediate threat to us or trying to attack us. So I basically do the same thing as him, and I've got a Stevens pump on me or whatever. So I unload 6 rounds or whatever, about the same area that he did. Same exact thing. It never stops, or it just keeps going. And so we looked at each other, and was just like mind blown. But oh yeah, one thing I forgot to mention: the dog, when it came out, like it took off running towards the wood line, like growling and sniffing the ground and stuff. And as soon as it started to step into the woods before Grant could call it back, it just immediately started whining, turned around, ran in behind both of us, and went up under the steps of the front porch and stayed there the whole entire time. He had literally, after we got done shooting and everything, my buddy had to go over there and basically rip it out from underneath the porch because it refused to come out unless he drug it out. But yeah, that was pretty much my first encounter with what we believe was a Sasquatch. I didn't see it visually with my own eyes, but after talking, and like I've hunted and fished my whole life, been out in the woods, and I've never heard anything like that loud. And like I said, it clearly was upright walking to us. And yeah, and a couple years prior to this, before I was staying there with him, he had a buddy from New Jersey living with him. And at the time I was living up at the top of the road. My parents had passed away at this point, and I was staying there through property until me and my siblings was able to get it sold, kind of overlooking the place. And they had came up there and knocked on the door one night. It was kind of late, and they was like, "Hey, dude, you need to come and check out this shelter that we found out in the woods in front of Grant's or whatever." And I was like, "What do you mean a shelter?" And at the time, it didn't really like click with me or whatever, because I've been researching this stuff for a long time and heard about the stick structures and different shelters and things, and never seen one personally. But like at the time, like that's just like the furthest thing from my mind. And they was assuming that it was built like by a homeless person or something. But apparently they had found it like I think a couple months prior or whatever. And because they was out there making like a little fire pit in the woods, basically in the same exact location where it sounded like the huge footsteps were coming from that me and Grant had heard. Well, like we put on some headlamps and went down there and checked it out. And by this point, like it was, the weather had kind of taken its toll on it, and like some of it had fell apart or whatever. But I got to looking at it, and after we got down to the woods, I was like, dude, this is awful big and like, pretty intricate for some random homeless person to set up out here in the middle of the woods. And it was almost like a teepee formation, but like at the top of it, it had like a huge limb. It was probably at least 10 to 12 feet long, like sticking through the top of it, like horizontally. And like I said, at that point, it had fell down, and the weather had gotten to it a lot, but it was pretty odd. And I didn't want to mention at the time, that I believed it could have been possibly from a Sasquatch or something like that, because, the one guy, he's from New Jersey, and I've never heard him speak about anything like that. And Grant, I've known my whole life, and he knew I was kind of into the subject or whatever. But I didn't mention the whole shelter thing until to Grant, actually, after our incident a few years later or whatever. And then he was like, "Oh man!" And now he's like, he researches it and looks into it and stuff, and tries to find signs. Like he had moved away from there for a while, and he's back now or whatever. And he goes out there and tries to see if he can find anything new or footprints or anything, which he hasn't. But we've actually went out there before. I believe it. Yeah, this was before we had heard the footsteps or whatever, maybe a month before. And like, if there was an aerial view, it's kind of hard to explain the shape of the woods or whatever that's in front of his property, but like it's off of a major highway, but like, once you get in there, it's pretty deep. But the wood line in front of his house, if you're looking at it from an aerial view, it's like an L shape. It goes by his grandparents' place and then wraps around long ways right in front of his house. Well, once you go through there, there's a little opening, kind of like a small field, and it's got a power line that runs through the middle of it. And me and my dad, that's the spot that we hunted at. The majority of my childhood was out there in that little opening. Well, on the other side of it, the woods are pretty deep down in there. And me and Grant just went around there poking around, messing around one day. And we don't know the guy, but, we can see his house once you go down the road a little ways or whatever when you're driving. There's a brick house. Well, this guy owns some cattle or whatever. And you go so far into the woods or whatever, you'll run into the fence. Well, we was walking around down there one day. We found a dead cow laying in a little creek. I mean, the creek wasn't at this point like 2 or 3 inches deep, and it was laying on its side. So we couldn't see the side that, it was facing the creek to see if there was any damage to it there. But on the other side, it was completely untouched. I mean, it could have died from a number of things. But then as like we went on, we found like, I don't know, like maybe 50 to 60 different cow bones. And like we got a little bit further in and we found 2 coyote skulls, which we kept. And I've got a picture of one of those on my Facebook. But just that whole area down there, it just gives you a creepy vibe, even since childhood or whatever. Growing up, I heard some weird stuff out there, like, weird noises I couldn't really identify and just got a creepy vibe off of it. But that's the first time I really explored it extensively is when me and Grant went down there looking around. And after that incident with we hearing the footsteps and me and him going out there exploring, I was working out of town and I got in, it was probably about 1 o'clock at night. And Grant, he wasn't there, but his girlfriend at the time was, and she stays up pretty late. So she let me in, and I come in, cook me something to eat, lay down and watch a movie for a little while. Well, maybe 2 hours later, I go out to smoke a cigarette, and I'm out there smoking a cigarette, and coming from not the wood line directly in front of the house, but the area from where me and him had went down there and found all the bones and the coyote skulls and stuff, we hear I heard a tree falling or whatever, and there was no wind blowing whatsoever. It was like extremely loud, just crash out of nowhere, like 2, 3 in the morning. And I was like, what the? So like, I finished smoking my cigarette and I come inside, and his girlfriend at the time, she was already, passed out at this point, and it had woken her up. It was so loud. And she was like, what was that noise? She's like, I heard you go outside. She's like, did something fall or something outside? And I told her it sounded like a tree, down in the woods or whatever had fell. She's like, is the wind blowing or is there a storm? There was no storm or wind whatsoever when that tree had fell. Well, I eventually went to bed. The next morning I get up and I was like, I'm going to go down there and check out, the area and see if I can find exactly where the tree had fell. Well, I go down there and I get to looking around or whatever. And, I finally find the tree that had fell or whatever, and it was a dead tree, but I found that, basically the stump, where it had broke off at towards the bottom, like it wasn't broke off towards the top, like, you see, like with a lot of people finding the tree breaks or whatever, like it had fell or whatever. It was a dead tree. But the weird thing about it was I seen the impression on the ground of the leaf litter where the tree had fell. But the tree was dragged, and you can see the drag marks of the tree like maybe 40 to 50 feet away, and was just laid like in a kind of like a little natural ditch or whatever, kind of laid across it. And I get over there and look down in the ditch and find a couple weird little rock piles like inside the ditch where the tree had been drugged to and laid. And that was just pretty strange. I got after I found the tree like that, and then obviously the rocks just a few minutes later, I just got a real creeped out vibe and I got out of Dodge. But that's pretty much the extent of the encounters that I had in that area in Hamptonville when I was living there.
The behavior that you describe with shooting into the woods is fascinating to me because I hear this often with people who have these types of encounters. I don't think guns scare these things. I don't think shots scare them. I don't think loud noises scare them. If that were a person, that person would have, like you said, you're in rural North Carolina. You're not gonna exactly. You're not gonna show up on somebody's property unannounced. Number one. Number two, if somebody starts shooting, you're gonna identify yourself and say, "Hey, dude, don't shoot." Yeah. Whatever. And any wild animal is going to immediately bolt.
It would have. If it was a deer, it would have been gone. Like, I've accidentally snuck up on a deer, didn't even realize it was near me, like close or far. They hear a tree break, they're out of there, like a twig snap, anything. Yeah. And whatever this was, it didn't frighten it whatsoever. And like, with him calling out, like I said, him just calling out to it before the shots were even fired, and them not even to stop or anything, I was like, yeah, this is this is pretty peculiar to say the least.
That's definitely weird behavior. So I know you've had some folks in your family that have had encounters. So sort of tell us about what happened there.
Yeah, okay. Like I said, my father, he was older or whatever. I'm the youngest out of all my siblings. I'm 31, and the closest sister to me in age she's in her 40s or whatever, like 42. It's the closest age sister. So I'm pretty much an accident. But my father, he was born in 42, and they lived up in Boone, like coming right into Boone. They've changed the name of the road several different times, but it's on the left-hand side, and it like runs adjacent to the parkway up there. Well, the road that they lived on literally runs through a mountain. Like as soon as you enter on the road, and for a long time, they didn't have guardrails coming through there. And you look off the left side and it's just a massive drop off. Well, what got me into the whole cryptid subject, especially, with Sasquatch or whatever, and being fascinated with this was because the stories my dad and uncles would tell me growing up. And I'm assuming this was like in the 60s or whatever. And my dad, since he's passed, I really regret not chronicling any of this or writing any of it down or recording it, which I'm trying to get up with my uncle as soon as possible and try to record it and, document it and possibly write, a book on all the stuff that, had taken place up there. But they had these incidents, like I said, I believe it was in the 60s, with a creature that they called the Squalin thing. And it's because the screams that it would let out throughout the middle of the night. Well, one of the stories I remember hearing my dad telling, he was at my grandparents' place, his mom and dad's, and it was probably like 2-3 o'clock in the morning, and he gets up or whatever to, I guess, catch a fresher breath of air, walks out on the porch or whatever, and just standing. And, at this point in time, I believe, they had been hearing these noises for a little bit with this certain encounter, but he's standing out there. And like I said, this road runs slap dab middle in the middle of the mountain. And, the house or whatever where he was at, my grandparents' place, like it was on the left hand side of the road, kind of going up at a slope onto the mountain. So like the porch, he's looking out on the other side, like crossing the road up on the other side of the mountains, what he's staring at. And this thing just starts letting out this god awful scream. And they compared it to like a woman screaming. And I've heard different people say, oh, well, that's possibly a mountain lion and this and that. And in the beginning, a lot of folks up there was believing that it was a mountain lion that was letting out these screams or whatever. Well, my dad's standing out there. This thing is on top of the mountain, is where he believes it initially starts screaming at. And he's standing there, and he said within a matter of maybe 5 minutes, this thing is just hauling down the mountain, screaming the whole way down. And it was so loud, it woke up my grandmother, and she comes out on the porch with my dad. My dad's name was Curly, and she's like, what is that? Well, she knew what it was at the time or whatever, but like she was still mind blown this was going on because nobody had no idea what this thing was. And I'll get in a little bit to it later of what they started to do about these encounters. But she steps out there and she was like, it's just impossible how this thing is moving, how fast it moves. Well, he was standing there. He was like, yeah, it's pretty eerie. And like he said, he's starting to get the goosebumps up on his arms or whatever. Because, other times when they heard it screaming, it would get close. But this time it was down in the wood line across the road from them. And they heard it kick up gravel in the actual road or whatever. It got so close. And at that point, he turned around and got my grandmother back inside and locked the door. But, it was just insane yelling or whatever. And he said, and another thing that I've always heard is like the feeling you get if you hear a Sasquatch scream, like the reverberation or whatever, you can feel it in your chest and your body or whatever. My dad said like he just had this weird sensation. But I think when he immediately stepped out before he even hear the screaming, he just had this odd feeling. And then the screaming began. Well, I think maybe a few weeks later after this, and like I said, this had been going on for a little while. They was a mountain community or whatever. And, back then there was a lot of rugged guys around and like you hear about some of the older stories, people hear these screams or they, have a sighting or something. They want to mount a posse up and go looking for this thing. Well, at this point in time, nobody had ever actually witnessed it like firsthand. They just heard the screams that it was letting out. Well, a guy that lived on the road, I can't remember exactly what the dude's name was, but he had family from Louisiana or whatever, and he had went down there and visited with them, like around the time that the Squalin thing, as they called it, all that stuff was going on. So he told, his family, some dude down there in Louisiana, that, they had this weird activity, this screaming going on, and nobody knew what it was. They had never seen it or whatever. Well, he had a bunch of tracking dogs, and he swore by these dogs that they would literally track anything. And he was like, when you go back to Boone or whatever, he's like, we'll come with you and we'll bring these dogs up there and, see if we can track and flush this thing out. Well, in between that time, my dad, he had walked to a movie theater in town, which was a pretty decent hike. But back then, you can hitchhike or walk or whatever, and you didn't have to worry about, lunatics as much back then compared to today. And my dad had walked to the theater or whatever. And I think this particular time he was by himself. He was coming back, and it was probably 11, 12 o'clock at night. And he gets onto the beginning of the road, and it's a pretty good little stretch from the beginning of the road down to their house. Well, he gets on the road, and he hears on the right-hand side or whatever from the mountain, like these strange noises, something moving around or whatever. And at first, he chalked it up to being like a deer or something. I mean, it wasn't really loud. And then as he started walking, whatever it was started following him through the woods or whatever, paralleling him. He was like, what is that? He kept going. He would stop, and the thing would stop. And he was like, what the hell? Well, he gets a little bit further, and he said he's starting to get, he's really spooked by this time, and said he's getting ready to just bolt and just run the rest of the way home. He's like, something just told him to look over into the woods or whatever, because he had glanced over a couple times, but as he kept going, like he was just trying to keep from looking over there, I guess probably out of fright. And I've never seen my dad, my experiences with him be scared about anything. So right before he's getting ready to bolt, he looks over into the trees and he sees red eye shine. Well, it had glowing red eyes, but my dad, what confused him about it, well, not only the glowing red eyes, but whatever it was really low to the ground in the woods. Like the eye shine wasn't really up high. And so, like, a lot of people's like, well, when they see eye shine and people, believe it's a Sasquatch, they see it, 7, 8, 9 feet in the air or whatever, like up by trees. But, I didn't know for the longest time after all the research I was doing until like so many years back that, a lot of these things crawl around on all fours. And I've heard plenty of encounters now, listening to different shows and documentaries and stuff about them, crawling around on all fours. And he bolts at home. Well, a few of his friends, maybe 2 or 3 nights later, my dad wasn't with him at this point in time. They go to the theater and come back. They had a similar encounter. They didn't see the red eye shine, but whatever was in the woods, like it started paralleling them, but it sounded like it was starting to come out to the road. So they booked it all the way to like the nearest friend's house or whatever, and basically all but broke the front door in, like trying to, get into the house or whatever. And I believe their parents, the one guy's parents woke up and opened the door and let him in or whatever, and they closed it, and they were scared to death. Well, that had happened in between the guy went to Louisiana. Well, they come back down and they bring these dogs out. And my Uncle Donnie, like my dad, he had told, so many different stories or whatever, but I remember this one in particular coming from my Uncle Donnie. And he said that they bring these dogs in and they start off in the evening time. I think it was like around 6 o'clock. It hadn't got dark yet. And they was going around the areas where they was going around knocking on door to door because they all knew each other, it's a mountain community. And, there's like, well, where have you been hearing it from? Or where's the last time that you heard it? Because the guy was down in Louisiana and he didn't know if there had been any activity going on. Well, they had spoke with my dad's family, and my dad told him about the encounter that he had and all that up towards the top of the road. And then somebody had heard it on the other side of my grandparents' place. Well, so that's where they start off at. And the dogs are going around in the woods sniffing. They all got guns looking around, and they ain't coming up with nothing. Well, it starts to get dark, and one of the guys in the group, it's like, well, let's try this one spot. And like a little bit further up the road. And the more you go up, the higher in, elevation it gets, like up into the mountain or whatever. And it comes to like a little field, and and goes into the woods or whatever. Well, they get the dogs out and out of the truck, and they get them on the leashes or whatever, start going into the field or whatever. Well, they get right up to the wood line or whatever, and they just start tucking tail and whining and wanting to run in circles. And then finally, I think 2 out of the 3 or 4 dogs that they had, break free of the leash or whatever that the owner's holding and just books it back to the truck. And then at that point, when, the guy that owned the dogs, knowing that, these things would track anything, he's tracked several different, animals with them, that something weird was going on. So, and the other dogs were, fighting to go back to the truck. So they took him back to the truck, and one of the guys or whatever was still standing out there with a light. He walks over into the woods, he starts to walk into the woods a little bit and sees what he says is a gigantic looking human, almost footprint, right there into the woods or whatever. And that's where that one kind of ends or whatever. All I can remember of it. My Uncle Donnie, I go up and visit my parents' grave in Boone, as often as I can. And I've been meaning to get up with him and actually sit down and talk more about the incident, some of the incidents they had growing up. But my Uncle Joey, though, and he's a little bit younger than some of my uncles, and I think he was 12 at the time. And I'm not really for sure if this was around the whole Squalin thing incident, or if it was before or after. But I need to really speak with him too. But my Uncle Donnie, I called him on the phone, and he's an older mountain guy. He don't like talking on the phone. He don't even own a cell phone. So I reached out to him a few weeks ago and told him I was coming on the show and asked him if he'd kind of refresh my memory on some of the stories. And he didn't talk real long or whatever, but we spoke about my favorite story out of it, all of them or whatever, was an actual eyewitness encounter that my Uncle Joey had. Well, and I can't remember exactly the details, if this calf had got lost or he was just going to check on the cows. But if I'm not mistaken, he was going after a calf that kept escaping or whatever. He kept getting out of the pen or whatever and trying to go up onto the mountainside. And well, I think it was snowing. Yeah, it was snowing during this incident. And he goes out and realizes that the calf was gone. So he was like, dang it, I'm going to have to go up there, trot up the mountain, try to find this thing. Because I always tried going, I think they said it was a little clearing, up above the house, going up towards the top of the mountain. So he suits up in some warm gear or whatever and puts on a full face toboggan, like a ski mask. It's got the eye holes in the mouth. And he takes off trekking in the snow to go try to retrieve this calf. Well, he gets up the mountain or whatever, and he's the snow is so deep that he's kind of watching his footing or whatever to make sure he's not going to trip over a stick or something and break his ankle. And he's kind of paying attention to where he's walking, and he comes up into the clearing or whatever, and he's not even looking into the clearing yet. And then when he looks up, he sees what he believes is a baby black bear, laying facing away from him, in a fetal position. And it had black fur or whatever and real small. And it was in a fetal position, kind of in the right outside the wood line, basically right at the edge of the clearing or whatever, maybe 15 feet at the most from him. So he's just standing there watching it. And I guess he makes a step forward or moves and makes some kind of noise. And the thing jumps up on 2 legs, turns around and looks at him. And he said it's maybe 5 feet in height and looks just like a gorilla to him. And he says, it looks at my Uncle Joey with this weird expression and kind of tilts its head to the side, what is he? And it probably looks, my Uncle Joey probably looks similar to it because he has this full face toboggan on and it's black or whatever. And it's got these eye holes and this, cut out for the mouth. But yeah, it tilts its head with this curious expression on what is this? And then starts beating its chest, turns around and darts into the wood line. And that was his experience. I've heard it from him when I was a kid, but he don't live in Boone no more. He lives, I believe, actually up above Lenore somewhere. But I'm going to have to get in touch with him and actually expand a little bit on the story more. But that was the one face-to-face encounter that they had because, in the beginning, they wouldn't, nobody really seen it or really knew what was going on. A lot of people saying, oh, well, this is a mountain lion and this and that. And then the more time went on and they brought the dogs out, and then one of the guys seen a footprint. And then eventually, like I said, I'm not for sure if I guess the sighting probably that my uncle had taken place after they brought the dogs out and everything like that. But yeah, it was pretty cool.
I was going to ask if anybody had actually seen the squalling thing. Did people have an idea of what they thought it was other than a mountain lion? Maybe did anybody think it might have been a Sasquatch?
Yeah, well, my Uncle Donnie, like when those guys had came out, at that point, a lot of people, like I said, was believing it was a mountain lion because the screaming or whatever. And then the guy that found the footprint, like in the woodline or whatever, I think he said, he didn't have no measuring tape on him or nothing like that, but I believe he stuck his foot beside of it and said this thing was probably 18 inches in length and maybe like 7 or 8 inches across. So, after that, and that guy, he wasn't the dude from Louisiana. He was one of the guys that had banded up with a posse to go out looking for it. And he didn't tell that story for a long time because, back then, especially like, you believe in Bigfoot and like, small farming communities and stuff, you get a bad reputation. So he didn't say nothing for the longest time. And then years later, he came out, and said that he found that print. And he didn't even tell none of the guys that he was with that night that he had seen it. And then years later, as he got older, he finally came out and started telling a few people in the community. And one of the ones he told was my Uncle Donnie. And then my Uncle Donnie, he, years later, after the activity had ceased, he went around kind of speaking to some of the older individuals that were still alive when that was going on or whatever. And I guess had spoke to the guys that had the tracking dogs and stuff and a few other people. And they had all came to the conclusion that it was a Sasquatch. And then with my Uncle Joey sighting and the footprint, and then an older lady that lived up towards the top of the mountain or whatever at the end of the road, she had said that she was hearing what sounded like beating, like in the woods, like basically like what, we know today as wood knocks. And where she lived was a lot more remote than everybody else on the road. The whole place was pretty remote and they was kind of, spaced out pretty good, but she lived off by herself and was widowed. But she was hearing, these continuing wood knocks, around her house, like when the whole Squalin thing was going on. And then she had some chickens that had got missing from her little coop or whatever outside. And she found a bunch of feathers and thought that, maybe a fox or something like that had got to it. Well, her daughter, I can't remember how long it was after that incident, or it might have been a few years, something like that. I had to speak with my Uncle Donnie again, but she was pulling into her driveway one night and seen something peering from behind the house or whatever, like in between two trees at her. And she was thinking it was a bear. And she got out of the car and she basically all but run to the house. And as she started to run towards the house, like move quickly to the front porch, she seen it turn to its side and walk off up the hill. She didn't see its face clear enough in the beginning or whatever to really tell what it was. But when it turned around, she seen it was walking upright and had a conical shaped head and like had this huge, massive, like bodybuilder type back. And it just walked up to the, into the trees or whatever, into the forest or whatever. But but my uncle's sighting, his was the most prominent, like face to face, like close encounter that was reported up there, as far as I know. But like I said, I'm going to speak with my Uncle Donnie more or whatever in person and try to actually record and document some of this stuff a lot more when I get up there.
Yeah, man, I love that. I think that's a great idea. It's the best way to preserve it and have it so people can learn from their experiences from way back then, because like you said, they didn't really talk about it back then. We're literally like 30 minutes away from that area in Boone, and we hear the things on our property here in Lenoir. We've got about 40 acres here in Lenoir. We've never seen one on the property, but we've heard them vocalize and we've heard the yells and the screams, and it's pretty interesting stuff, man. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing. And once you get back with your Uncle Donnie, I'd love to have you back on the show and maybe if you have some more experiences that you get from him, and we'd love to have you back for a second time on the show for sure.
Okay, yeah, most definitely, man. And there's a couple reports where I'm living at in Rockingham County I'm working on right now that happened right off the Dan River, that somebody reported rock throwing while they was kayaking down through there. And there's the Dan River campground. I'm going to get out there this summer and get out on my kayak and try to find the exact location of where that happened at, and try to do a little bit of field research myself when I actually get the time to, and look more into that. But
awesome. Well, if you come across anything out there and you have any more experiences, definitely you've got my number. Just give me a call and let me know. We'd love to have you back.
All right, I most definitely will, man.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show, man. It was some fantastic stuff, and you have a good evening.
You as well, man. Thanks for having me on.
All right, I want to welcome Justin to the show. Justin comes to us from Tennessee. Welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. The pleasure's mine. So I know you've had an encounter, and I want you to sort of take us back to what you were doing, where you were, and what happened out there, man.
Well, I was actually supposed to go on a camping trip with my dad. This was back in, I believe, June or July of 2015. And we were going camping in Cherokee National Forest up on the Tellico River. You know, we've got a place where we've camped since I was little. You know, he's always took me there. And I was going to meet up with him. He was coming across. He had moved to South Carolina for a job, and I was living here where I live in Tennessee. And I got up there. Well, I waited and waited and waited, and he never showed up. So I drove back down about 20 minutes to the closest payphone, which is at a little gas station just outside of the national park, and called him only to find out that he had car problems. He wasn't going to be there. I figured, okay, well, I go back up, stay the night, whatever, no big deal. So I get back to my camp, and roughly about 10 o'clock at night, I decided, to pack it in, call it a night, and go to bed. So about, I guess, 2, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm laying in my tent, and I hear something hit my tent. I wasn't sure what it was, so I unzipped my window, looking out the door to see if maybe my dad had showed up and was throwing something at the tent to try to wake me up so he could, being that far out in the woods, you don't want to sneak up on somebody. But I didn't see anybody. I had my lantern going on the table, so I laid back down and I heard it again. I thought, well, this is odd. So I unzip my tent door, I climb out, I start looking around, and then I see a rock about the size of probably the end of your thumb came flying in and hit my rain fly on my tent. Well, instantly I dove back into my tent and grabbed my 9mm pistol and my spot oil flashlight, crawled back out of the tent, was looking around, and all that I could see was the bushes moving as this thing was running back up this valley. And this area used to have old four-wheel drive trails in it, and it goes way back up to a waterfall. It's several miles long, and he was running back up this valley, and all I could see was the underbrush moving as he was running away. So I went and got back in my tent and laid down. Of course, sometime during the night, I fell back asleep. But the next morning, I got up and packed everything and left. I was not staying there another night by myself.
Yeah, I can't say that I blame you for that. Did you get a chance to see what it was that was running away? Could you tell if it was bipedal or was it on all fours?
Well, the underbrush there, I say underbrush because this is in the national forest. The underbrush there is thick laurel, and I'm 6'3", and the laurel's over my head, and all I could see was a big, tall, black shadow running through I couldn't see its face or nothing like that because it had its back turned running up the valley. My guess is, and I this is just me taking a wild guess, that this thing had came down the valley, seen a camp. There was only one vehicle there. Nobody was staring around. It was throwing rocks to see if anybody was there. Because in that area, people will park and they'll leave. They'll park their vehicles there, set up a camp, and then they'll leave. And they'll come back the next day or whatever, just so they have a campsite for when they come back. So my thinking is this thing came out of that valley and was checking to see if anybody was there. Well, I jumped out with a gun, and I guess I startled it just as much as it startled me. It went one way, and I went back into the tent.
Yeah, that rock throwing thing has always fascinated me, man, because I talk to people often. I talk to Steve Coles, the Squatch detective. His episode's going to be coming up here in the next month or so. And Steve he's done this investigative thing for like 25 years with these things. He's been on about every show there is to have anything to do with Sasquatch or cryptids, right? And I asked Steve, like, what do you think about this rock throwing thing that they do? And he had a pretty good answer, and I'd never really thought about it this way, but he said, I think they throw rocks to figure out, just like you said, if there's somebody in a house or if there's somebody in a tent or whatever the case may be, they're trying to get a reaction, right? So they throw these rocks to see if anybody's home. And
yeah, that was definitely the way that I took it. Was just, checking to see, because I know that I've parked up there and set my tent and my camp up and everything, and then I've left and went back to town, and I come back. It's common practice up there. But that was my thinking was, I had coolers. It's easy to tent. It thanks food. There's a free meal right here. So that was my thinking.
Yeah. Have you had any other experiences in the past, or was Sasquatch on your radar at the time? What did you think this thing was when you had this incident?
I don't want to say I was a non-believer. I guess I fell into the group that I believed in the possibility that something could be out there, just because there's so much of these mountains here that are unexplored that no man's ever set foot. But at the same time, it was one of those, I'll have to see it to believe it. The only other thing I've had happen was in that same area. I've seen a few odd, tree structures and stuff, and I've heard really loud screams in the middle of the night, but I always just chalk it up to some other kind of animal. But other than that, I've never actually had a visual, but that was enough to get me to leave the next morning. So
yeah, I can't say that I blame you, man. We live here in North Carolina. We're in the foothills of North Carolina, just outside of Boone, and we have a 40-acre property here, and we've never seen the things, but we hear the vocalizations during the winter time. We hear them often. And just as recently as about a month and a half ago, we were sitting up we have a tiny house, and we had the windows open in the loft right before bed, and I was doing some work for the show, and we hear 50 yards away this almost Ohio howl-like scream. And there's nobody else. There's hundreds of acres of just land around us. There's nobody that lives there. And that's the only thing it could be. So it's wild, man. We'd heard it in the distance in the past. Like I said, we'd be out in the hot tub over the winter, and we'd hear these things, way back on the ridge, 150, 200 acres away or more. But this was 50 yards away from the house. So
yeah, that's starting to get a little too close for comfort.
Yeah, man, it's something else. Yeah. And people,
there was one night that we were actually in the same spot we were camping, and there was about 5 or 6 of us, and it was cold. It was, I would say, mid-January, early February. And this was a year prior to me being up there by myself. But we were all sitting around the campfire, and it was probably 11, 12 o'clock at night. It's good, clear, bright moon, everything. It's, middle of winter time, at nighttime, it's clear and cold. And we're all, like I said, we're all sitting around the fire. And from the ridge that's across the river behind us and up probably halfway up the ridge, there was something that let out a scream, and I have nothing to compare it to. I mean, I've heard bobcats. I've heard, being from Tennessee, I've heard bears. This was if you could imagine a woman screaming mixed with a real deep bass, I can't explain it. It was just the most odd thing I've ever heard, and it went on for what seemed like forever. And it was enough to drive everybody to, call it a night and go to bed early.
Yeah, until you hear these things vocalized for yourself, there's no recordings that do any justice. I've had Ron Moorhead on the show, and we played some of the Sierra sounds, and Ron sent me most of the sounds, and I listened to them on my computer and through my headphones, and there's just nothing that does it justice if you're not hearing it with your naked ear at the time. People just don't realize how loud these things are, and it literally vibrates your insides is what it, I guess that's why they some people have the theory about infrasound. I can certainly understand that because I've heard it 50 yards away, and it's like no other sound I've ever heard. It's the wildest thing
definitely.
in the world.
Yeah, this thing, it echoed up this river valley. It echoed for a long way. The sound just traveled, but like I said, it seemed like it felt like it went for 15 or 20 seconds, just this loud roar. And I had nothing to compare it to. I mean, it had the deep sound of like a lion or a tiger, but it also had the high pitch of like a woman screaming all in one. And I was, yeah. It's one of those that it leaves you like the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you're speechless going, what the hell was that?
Yeah. And it'll definitely make you vacate the premises. That's for sure.
Yeah. We decided to call it a night and pack it in. The only other thing that I would, looking back now, at the time I thought maybe, when I was a kid, my dad, we would always go to bed and you could hear rocks clacking in the river. And when we were kids, Dad always used to say, oh, that's just bears scavenging, or the current is just making the rocks tumble. Well, as I got older and started getting more into the Bigfoot subject, looking back, could that have been what that was? I mean, they come down from the valley because there's no access to the other side of this river anywhere. And it's just miles and miles of wilderness. Could those things have been coming down into the river and turning these rocks over? Because we were never allowed to venture outside the campsite at night.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I've talked to people, and I've even had experiences now that I look back. Bigfoot was never really on my radar. I mean, when I was a kid, I had an experience when I was about 12. I was hunting in the woods, and one of these things ran me out of the woods. I was paced out of the woods, and there was vocalizations, there was huffing, it was clearly nothing I'd ever experienced. I didn't see it, but I'm certain that that's what it was. I grew up in the North Georgia mountains, and we heard about them, when I was a kid. I heard stories and things like that, but it wasn't really on my radar. But now I look back and I think some of the other experiences and some of the things that I heard when I was out hunting in the woods were probably Sasquatch. And I talk to people who have that same experience often. They're like, well, I didn't really think about that, but there was this thing that happened back in, when I was a kid. And I'm like, yeah, well, now looking back with the information you have today and all the information that's out there for you to find on the internet and shows like this and other places, you look now and you say, well, that could have been. And you're probably right.
Yeah, the reason that I feel like the one little glimpse that I caught of it running away was, like I said, the undergrowth of laurel. It's just so thick that even for somebody like me or anybody I know, you're almost on your hands and knees crawling through it. I mean, it's just tangled up, nasty vines and they're probably 10 to 12 feet tall. And all I seen was the shadow of this thing just kind of crashing through it, and you could see it just moving out of the way. It was too big to be a bear. Bears around here, when they're on all fours, they're 4 feet tall. They stand up, they're 6, 7 feet tall if they stretch. This thing was just crashing through the stuff like it wasn't nothing, and it was upright. So that's the reason. And I thought maybe somebody was throwing rocks at my tent trying to wake me up, but then I got to thinking, they're coming from the woods behind me. There's nothing back there at all. And why would, I can't think of another animal that does that.
Yeah, and you got to have thumbs to throw rocks. So if it's not a person, that sort of narrows things down for you, right? And
exactly.
It's not smart for anybody, and especially for people who don't live in the South. You usually don't go where you're not supposed to because people here have guns.
Right.
And they will shoot you. You don't walk into somebody's camp in the middle of the night and start doing things like that because people have guns and you're liable to get shot. So,
right.
Very interesting stuff, man. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your encounters with us. It's, some people look at, well, you didn't have a sighting, but I like to document things like this because I think the behavior is fascinating, right? Across the country, people see these things, they have encounters with them. And to me, it's all about documenting the encounters because I've heard the same thing over and over again from people in the Pacific Northwest that have had the exact same scenario happen to them that you had in Tennessee. So I think it's just as important as the visual sightings to document these types of encounters because I think a lot of people listen to it and they say, well, I've been out camping and there was pebbles coming in and I just thought it was dropped out of a tree by a squirrel or whatever, but that doesn't make sense. So I think it's very important to document these. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing, man.
Hey, I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. And that's it for this week's show, folks. Have a great night and we'll see you guys next week.